A 17-year-old obese girl was about to be hanged until Virgin Rancher did the unthinkable. Snow whips down the main street as the crowd gathers at the gallows. A trembling girl, cheeks flushed from cold and shame, stands with the rope at her neck, condemned for a crime she swears she didn't commit. The preacher's voice shakes through last rites, and the sheriff's smirking nephew watches, ready to see her drop. Then boots crunch through the snow. A quiet rancher steps forward, invoking a forgotten frontier law. In one shocking moment, he offers his name and her life. The crowd gasps, the hangman's hand freezes, and the rope is lowered. But mercy comes with a cost. In saving her, he's drawn the wrath of a man who will burn barns, steal land, and use the law itself to crush them both. Out here, winter can kill you, but so can the wrong enemy. What drove this rancher to risk everything for a stranger? And when the fight for survival turns to a fight for justice, will either of them live to see spring? This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The bitter wind howled down Trinity Fork's Main Street, driving needle-sharp snow into the faces of the gathered townsfolk. They huddled together in dark clusters, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air, as they watched the grim scene unfold before them. At the center of their attention stood the wooden gallows, its rough-hewn beams casting long shadows across the packed snow. Shackled to the post, 17-year-old Rosalind "Rosie" Dobbins trembled. Though whether from cold or fear, none could say. Her cheeks burned red against the pale morning light, marked by both the biting wind and the deeper sting of shame. She kept her eyes downcast, unable to meet the stares of the townspeople who had come to witness her supposed justice. The preacher's voice quavered as he read the last rites, his words nearly lost in the whistling wind. His leather-bound Bible shook in his mittened hands as he spoke of mercy and salvation. Just behind him, Clyde Parson, the sheriff's nephew, watched with an unmistakable smirk playing across his face. His satisfaction at Rosie's predicament was plain for anyone who cared to look. Everyone in town knew the truth of the matter, though few dared speak it aloud. Clyde had pursued Rosie with unwanted attention for months, cornering her with advances that made her skin crawl. When she'd finally gathered the courage to reject him publicly, the horse theft charges appeared as suddenly as spring storms on the prairie. His uncle, the sheriff, had been all too willing to accept his nephew's word without question. The crunch of boots through snow drew attention to a figure moving purposefully through the crowd. Eli Carter, 28 years old and owner of the Carter Creek Ranch, pushed his way forward. His usually quiet demeanor had given way to something stronger, though his hands shook slightly as he stepped into the space before the gallows. "I invoke the territorial statute," Eli called out, his voice carrying across the sudden hush that fell over the gathering. Section 23, paragraph 4. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "A condemned person may be spared if a respectable citizen takes responsibility through marriage." A wave of whispers swept through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. The preacher lowered his Bible, blinking in surprise. Even Clyde's smirk faltered for a moment as he processed this unexpected turn of events. Eli squared his shoulders, speaking directly to Rosie now. "Miss Dobbins, I offer you my name and my home." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I'll take responsibility for any debts and ... double quotes." He hesitated only briefly. ... supposed crimes. "Will you accept?" Rosie lifted her head for the first time, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at Eli. She had seen him before in town. Of course, everyone knew the quiet rancher who kept mostly to himself. But this she had never expected. The choice before her was clear: the rope or marriage to a virtual stranger. Yet something in Eli's steady gaze spoke of safety, of refuge from the storm that had nearly claimed her life. "Yes," she managed to whisper, then louder, "Yes, I accept." The hangman, who had been standing as still as a fence post throughout the exchange, finally moved. He lowered the rope that had been waiting for Rosie's neck, coiling it slowly as if uncertain about this turn of events. Sheriff Parsons stepped forward, his face a storm cloud of displeasure, but the law was clear. With visible reluctance, he produced the key and removed Rosie's shackles. Eli helped Rosie down from the platform, his gentle touch a sharp contrast to the rough handling she had endured in recent days. His wagon waited at the edge of the crowd, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold. The townsfolk parted before them, their expressions a mixture of shock, curiosity, and from some relief. As Eli helped Rosie into the wagon, she caught a glimpse of Clyde's face. The smirk had transformed into something darker, more dangerous, but for the moment, at least she was beyond his reach. Eli climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, urged the horses forward. The wind had not lessened as they left Trinity Forks behind, but Rosie found herself less bothered by it now. Eli's heavy wool coat appeared around her shoulders without a word from him, and she pulled it close, breathing in the scent of hay and leather. They rode in silence, the snow-covered prairie stretching endlessly before them, toward the promise of Carter Creek Ranch and whatever future awaited them there. The wagon wheels creaked and bounced over the frozen ruts of the trail, each jolt sending shivers through the wooden frame. Rosie sat hunched beside Eli, her wrists still bound by iron shackles. The rough wool blanket he had draped around her shoulders trapped what little warmth she could find against the biting wind. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the horse's steady breathing and the rhythmic squeak of leather harness. Finally, Rosie gathered her courage and turned slightly toward the quiet man beside her. "Why?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why would you do such a thing for a stranger?" Eli kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his hands steady on the reins. "No one deserves to hang for a lie," he said simply. The words hung in the cold air between them, plain and honest as the man himself. The justice's office sat at the edge of town, a weathered building with smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, the pot-bellied stove cast welcome warmth as the justice shuffled through his papers. The scratch of his pen seemed loud in the quiet room as he recorded their names and the marriage statute. When he finally looked up, he nodded to the sheriff's deputy who had followed them in. The key turned in Rosie's shackles with a sharp click, and the irons fell away. She rubbed her wrists, the skin red and chafed beneath. Back in the wagon, the afternoon sun did little to warm the air, but Rosie felt lighter without the weight of the shackles. Eli began pointing out landmarks as they traveled, his voice low and steady. "That's Carter land starting at the old oak there," he said, gesturing to a massive tree standing alone on a rise. "Creek runs down from the mountains, feeds the whole valley. Good water, never runs dry." He paused, then added, "My father named it Carter Creek. Simple man, my father." As they crested a small hill, Eli pointed again. "There's the barn roof, just coming into view. House is just beyond it." Rosie looked where he indicated, seeing the dark shape of the barn's peak against the graying sky. By the time they reached the ranch house, dusk had settled over the land. The scent of wood smoke drifted through the cracks around the door and windows, promising warmth within. Eli helped her down from the wagon, then led her to the house. The interior was simple, but well kept, with a stone fireplace and solid furniture that spoke of careful craftsmanship. He showed her through the main room to a smaller bedroom off to one side. "This is yours," he said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. Rosie stood in the doorway, taking in the sight. Clean quilts were folded neatly on the bed, their patterns familiar and comforting in the lamplight. A washstand stood in the corner, a white pitcher and bowl sitting atop it. Beside the bed, a worn Bible rested on a small table, its leather cover softened with age. The simple comfort of it all, the bed, the quilts, the pure ordinance of it, made her throat tight with unshed tears. She blinked hard, not wanting to. Cry in front of this man who had already shown her more kindness than she knew how to accept. "Supper's likely ready," Eli said quietly, seeming to understand her need for a moment alone. "Take whatever time you need." The venison stew had been warming on the back of the stove, filling the house with its rich aroma. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, steam rising from their bowls. Eli broke the silence as they ate, his voice matter of fact. "Reckon we should talk about how things will work," he said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Ranch needs daily tending, horses, cattle, repairs. I do most of it, but there's always house chores too. We can share the work, each doing what we're able." He paused, making sure she was listening. "Beyond that, only rule is mutual respect. You'll have your privacy in your room. No obligations beyond what you're comfortable with." Rosie nodded, something tight in her chest loosening at his words. The stew was warm and filling, the first real meal she'd had in days. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, the wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing. But the quilts were warm, and the room was her own. For the first time in months, there were no rough hands grabbing at her, no sneering faces pressed too close, no cold cell floor beneath her. Just clean sheets, soft quilts, and the knowledge that the door had a latch she could secure from the inside. As sleep began to creep over her, Rosie listened to the occasional creak of the house settling and the distant sound of Eli moving about, banking the fire for the night. Her eyes grew heavy, and for the first time since her arrest, she drifted off without fear of what the morning might bring. The first rays of dawn had yet to breach the horizon when Rosie woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe-splitting wood. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the cracks around her door, rich and inviting. She dressed quickly in her old dress, smoothing it as best she could before stepping into the kitchen. Through the window, she could see Eli's broad shoulders, rising and falling as he worked at the woodpile. Steam rose from a coffee pot on the stove, and a bowl of cornmeal mush sat warming beside it. Rosie hesitated, then stepped onto the back porch. "Morning," she called softly. "Can I help with anything?" Eli paused mid-swing, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Morning," he considered for a moment. "Chickens need feeding, if you're willing. Feed's in the tin by the coop." Rosie nodded, grateful for the simple task. As she scattered corn for the clucking hens, she watched Eli stack the split wood against the house wall. There was a careful precision to his movements, a quiet attention to detail that spoke of long habit. Back in the kitchen, Eli served up 2 bowls of the cornmeal mush. Before eating, he bowed his head briefly, lips moving in silent prayer. The gesture touched something in Rosie's heart. Not the showy prayers of the prison preacher, but a simple, private moment of gratitude. "Porch could use a sweep," Eli mentioned as they finished breakfast. "Brooms by the door. After that, you're welcome to look around the property. Just ... He hesitated. Stay within sight of the house. The morning passed in a rhythm of simple tasks. After sweeping, Rosie's curiosity drew her to the barn. The heavy door creaked as she pushed it open, letting in a shaft of winter sunlight. 2 horses turned their heads to look at her, one a sturdy bay, the other a dappled gray. In a corner pen, a young calf huddled under a tarp, shivering against the cold. Rosie approached the horses slowly, letting them catch her scent. The gray stretched its neck toward her, nickering softly. She stroked its velvet nose, remembering how Clyde's false accusation of horse theft had nearly cost her life. These horses were clearly well cared for, their coats brushed and stalls clean. Later, she wandered down to Carter Creek. The water ran swift and clear beneath a thin crust of ice along its edges. The creek cut through the property like a lifeline, and Rosie could see why the land here was valuable. In this part of the territory, water was more precious than gold. When evening came, Eli heated up leftover stew and cut thick slices of bread. As they ate, he spoke more than he had all day, telling her about the creek's history. "My father made a treaty with the Ute tribe 30 years ago," he explained, breaking off a piece of bread. "They recognized our claim to the creek, and we promised never to dam or divert it. It's the only reliable water source for 50 miles in summer." Rosie listened, watching the lamplight play across Eli's serious face as he spoke of his father's handshake agreement with the tribal elder. She could tell by his tone how much he valued that promise. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats shattered the quiet evening. Eli was on his feet in an instant, reaching for the rifle mounted above the door. Rosie's heart hammered in her chest as a horse's snort and the crunch of boots on frozen ground came from the yard. "Carter!" Clyde Parsons' voice rang out, slurred with whiskey. "Bring that thieving woman out here." Eli opened the door, rifle held ready but pointed down. "Go home, Parson. You're drunk." "That's my uncle's prisoner you took," Clyde snarled. "Ain't right, what you did. Ain't natural." "The law allowed it," Eli said evenly. "She's my wife now, legal and proper." "Go sleep it off." Clyde's horse danced beneath him, sensing his anger. "This isn't over, Carter. You mark my words, you'll regret stepping between me and what's mine. She was never yours." Eli's voice was quiet but firm. "Now ride out before you do something foolish." With a curse, Clyde wheeled his horse around and galloped off into the darkness. Eli stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then closed and barred the door. That night, Rosie lay awake in her bed, listening to every creak and whisper of the wind. Eli's kindness in saving her had made him a target for Clyde's hatred. The thought of bringing trouble to this peaceful home and its quiet owner filled her with a deep, gnawing worry. She had seen the cruel glint in Clyde's eyes, heard the threat in his voice. Whatever he planned, it wouldn't end with this night's drunken visit. 2 days after Clyde's midnight visit, the crunch of boots on the front porch announced the arrival of young Tommy, the post rider. Eli opened the door to find the boy holding out an official-looking envelope, his breath forming clouds in the frosty air. "From the county clerk's office, Mr. Carter," Tommy said, shifting from foot to stay warm. "Had to get your signature on this one." Eli signed the receipt and closed the door against the biting wind. The heavy paper bore the county seal, and his fingers grew cold as he read the formal text. Rosie looked up from where she was kneading bread dough at the kitchen table, her hands dusted with flour. "What is it?" she asked, noting the tight line of his jaw. "Clyde Parsons filed a claim on Carter Creek," Eli said, his voice flat. "Says the treaty with the Ute isn't valid because there's no official record." He set the paper down carefully, as if it might burn him. "Without that creek, nothing can survive here come summer." Rosie wiped her hands on her apron, leaving white streaks. "What can we do?" "We'll have to file a counterclaim," Eli said, already reaching for his coat. "But we'll need proof of the treaty rights. Best head to town now, before the weather turns." Worse. They hitched up the wagon together, working quickly in the sharp morning air. The horses' hooves broke through the crusty snow as they navigated the rutted road into Trinity Forks. The wagon jolted and swayed, forcing them to brace themselves against each bump. The county clerk's office was warm after the bitter ride, but the news inside was cold comfort. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly clerk, adjusted his spectacles as he reviewed their situation. "Without the original treaty documents, I'm afraid you don't have much of a case," he explained, shuffling through some papers. "Verbal agreements, even ones honored for decades, don't carry much weight against written claims these days." "But my father always kept everything properly documented," Eli protested. "There should be papers somewhere." "When did you last see them?" Jenkins asked. Eli's face fell slightly. "Not since before Father died. We had a flood in the house that spring. Moved a lot of things to the barn loft for safekeeping." "Well, find those papers," Jenkins advised, "and bring them to me straight away. Time's important in cases like this." The ride home seemed longer, the cold deeper. The sun was already sliding toward the horizon when they finally turned into the ranch yard. Eli helped Rosie down from the wagon, his strong hand steady at her waist despite the worry etched on his face. A weak bleating from the barn caught Rosie's attention. "The calf," she said, already hurrying toward the sound. "It doesn't sound." "Right." Inside the barn, they found the young calf huddled in its pen, its breath coming in ragged coughs. Rosie knelt beside it, touching its nose and feeling the heat there. "It's running a fever," she said, her voice concerned. "We need to get it warm and fed." She looked up at Eli. "The papers can wait until morning. This little one needs help now." Eli nodded, something warming in his expression as he watched her. Gather the calf into her arms. Together they carried it to the house, settling it near the stove. Rosie wrapped it in layers of burlap while Eli started a fresh fire. She measured milk into a pot to warm, then fashioned a feeding bottle from an old whiskey flask, using a scrap of clean cloth as a nipple. The kitchen filled with the sounds of the crackling fire, and the calf's labored breathing as Rosie sat on the floor beside it, patiently coaxing it to drink. Eli paused in his own tasks, watching her gentle movements and soft encouragement. "You're good with animals," he said quietly. Rosie glanced up, catching an expression in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a warmth that made her cheeks flush. "They don't judge," she replied, turning her attention back to the calf. "They just know if you mean them harm or good." The calf finally began to suckle properly, its tail giving a weak wag. Eli brought them both cups of hot coffee, settling into a chair nearby. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with its fury. But inside, despite the looming threat to their water rights, despite the uncertainty of the missing papers, there was a moment of peace in watching new life fight to survive. They would search the barn loft tomorrow, Rosie decided, watching Eli's tired face in the lamplight. Tonight was for tending what needed immediate care, the calf, their own cold-numbed bodies, and the tiny spark of trust growing between them. Dawn broke cold and clear over Carter Creek Ranch. Rosie stood at the kitchen window, watching her breath fog the glass as Eli added wood to the cook stove. The calf had made it through the night, its breathing easier now as it dozed in its makeshift bed near the warmth. "Best get started in the loft while we have good light," Eli said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Those papers have to be up there somewhere." The barn doors creaked open, letting in sharp morning sunlight that made the dust motes dance. Their boots echoed on the wooden ladder rungs as they climbed to the loft. The space stretched back into shadows, filled with decades of ranch life. Stacks of crates, old tack, broken furniture, and bundles of yellowed papers. "Where do we start?" Rosie asked, brushing cobwebs from her skirt. "Father kept most important papers in his old trunk," Eli replied, moving toward a leather-bound chest near the back wall. "But after the flood, everything got moved around." They worked methodically through the morning, sorting through brittle newspapers and faded ledgers. Rosie sneezed as dust tickled her nose, making Eli glance up with concern. The winter sun crept higher, sending bright shafts through gaps in the roof. "Boards." "Look at this," Rosie called suddenly, pulling a bundle from beneath an ancient saddle. Letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, the paper soft with age. She held them carefully, reading the first envelope. "They're addressed to your father from someone named White Elk." Eli crossed the creaking boards quickly. "White Elk, he was the Ute elder who signed the original treaty with my father." He took the bundle reverently, untying the ribbon. "These could be exactly what we need." Rosie found a clean piece of muslin in a nearby trunk. "We should wrap them properly, keep them safe until we can get them to town." She watched as Eli's careful hands smoothed the delicate papers, noting how his fingers trembled slightly. By midday, their search had yielded several promising documents. They climbed down from the loft, muscles stiff from crawling through the dusty space. Rosie brought out bread and cheese, and they settled on the front porch steps to eat, the winter sun warming their faces. "Tell me about your father," Rosie said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He must have been a good man to make such fair agreements with the Ute." Eli's face softened. "He believed in treating all people with respect. Said a man's word should be as solid as the ground he walked on." He brushed crumbs from his lap. "Taught me everything I know about ranching, about doing what's right, even when it's hard." The afternoon found them by the creek, working together to repair a broken fence post. The water gurgled beneath its icy edges as Rosie held the rails. Steady, her hands red with cold. Eli's hammer rang out in sharp strikes, driving nails true with practiced swings. "Clyde's got no right to this land," Rosie said firmly, watching the creek's flow. "No right at all." Eli paused in his work, studying her determined expression. "No," he agreed quietly. "He doesn't." That evening, the kitchen was warm and fragrant with rabbit stew. Eli told a story about his first attempt at breaking a horse, ending with him face down in a mud puddle. The sound of Rosie's laugh, bright and unexpected, filled the room. She looked surprised at herself, as if she'd forgotten she could make such a joyful sound. But as the lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls, Eli's expression grew serious. "These letters," he said, touching the wrapped bundle on the table, "they're important evidence. But Clyde's got connections at the territorial court. Without official certification of the treaty, the law might still favor his claim." Rosie set down her spoon, her face set with quiet determination. "Then we'll find a way to prove it's real. This creek, this ranch, it's all you have left of your father. I won't let Clyde take that from you." She spoke softly, but there was steel in her voice. Eli looked at her across the table, something unreadable in his eyes. The lamp flickered, casting warm light on her face, so different from the frightened girl he'd first seen at the gallows. She met his gaze steadily, and in that moment, they were no longer just two people bound by a desperate bargain, but partners facing a common enemy. The letters lay between them, fragile paper holding the weight of their hopes. While outside the creek continued its eternal song beneath the stars. A week passed in steady work and quiet companionship at Carter Creek Ranch. The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the wagon's wooden seat as Eli and Rosie rode into Trinity Forks. The letters from White Elk lay carefully wrapped in Rosie's basket. Covered with a clean cloth dot, the lawyer's office sat above the general store, its window lettered in fading gold paint. Inside, the small room smelled of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books. Mr. Harrison, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined the letters with careful hands while Eli and Rosie waited in straight-backed chairs. "These letters certainly support your claim," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his spectacles. "The correspondence between your father and White Elk clearly references the water rights agreement." He laid the papers down gently. "However, without the original treaty or a court-filed copy, they won't stand up to legal challenge." Eli leaned forward. "Is there any way to find a copy?" "The Territorial Records Office in Silver Bluff might have one," the lawyer replied. All official treaties were supposed to be registered there. "Silver Bluff?" Rosie asked. "How far is that?" 2 days' ride, weather permitting," Eli answered, his eyes meeting hers. "We could leave after Sunday service." Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly. "The sooner the better. Clyde Parsons' lawyer has already filed preliminary motions." Outside, the winter sun had warmed the air enough to turn the streets muddy. They mounted their horses, Eli on his bay gelding and Rosie on the gentler mare she'd been learning to ride. "Keep your hands steady," Eli instructed as they rode toward home. "That's it. Let the reins rest loose when she's walking calm." He watched Rosie's careful movements. "You've got good hands for it." Rosie smiled at the praise, sitting straighter in the saddle. The Mare responded to her growing confidence, step sure, and even on the rutted road. They rode past the creek. That marked the edge of Carter Land, its waters running swift and clear beneath patches of ice. "We'll need to pack warm for Silver Bluff," Eli said. "The mountain passes can turn treacherous this time of year." "I can help get everything ready tomorrow," Rosie offered, "after we finish the barn chores." That evening, after the dishes were cleared and the lamps turned low, Rosie knelt beside her bed. The quilt beneath her fingers was soft with age, its pattern barely visible in the dim light. She closed her eyes, hands clasped uncertainly. "Lord," she whispered, voice barely stirring the quiet air, "I know it's been years since I've talked to you proper." She paused, struggling with words long unused. "But if you're listening, we need help. Eli's a good man. He saved my life when he didn't have to. Please. Please help us find what we need in Silver Bluff." The next morning dawned gray and cold, with heavy clouds promising snow. Eli and Rosie worked steadily in the barn, checking harnesses and sorting through supplies they'd need for the journey. The familiar sense of hay and leather surrounded them as they moved about their tasks. "We should pack extra feed," Rosie said, measuring oats into canvas bags, "in case the weather turns bad." Ayla nodded, coiling a length of rope, and the heavy blankets, the ones in the chest by the door. The first snowflakes began drifting down as they worked, visible through the barn's open door. They fell slowly. At first, then faster, dusting the ground with white. Rosie paused in her task, watching the silent fall. "Do you think the snow will delay us?" she asked. "Not if it stays light like this," Eli replied, his voice steady with certainty. "We've got 2 days until Sunday. It should clear by then." They continued working as the snow fell outside, each lost in thoughts of the journey ahead. The Territorial Records Office seemed both a hope and a challenge, their best chance to save the ranch, but also a test of their newfound partnership. The calf in its pen lowed softly, and Rosie went to check on it, running her hand along its warming flank. "We'll need someone to look after the animals while we're gone." "Already spoke to Tom Jenkins down the road," Eli said. "He'll keep an eye on things." As afternoon settled into evening, they had most of their preparations complete. The snow continued falling, adding another layer of quiet to the already hushed landscape. Inside the barn, surrounded by the products of their labor, Eli and Rosie stood together, watching the white curtain beyond the door. "Whatever we find in Silver Bluff," Rosie said softly, "we'll face it together." Eli turned to look at her, his eyes warm despite the chill air. "Together," he agreed, and in that moment, the word held more meaning than either of them could say. Sunday. Morning painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold. The rising sun caught ice crystals hanging from bare branches, making them sparkle like chandelier pieces. Rosie stood before the small mirror in her room, smoothing her borrowed dress, one of Eli's mother's old ones that she'd carefully mended. The whitewashed church in Trinity Fork stood against the brilliant blue sky, its wooden steeple reaching toward heaven like a pointing finger. As Eli helped Rosie down from the wagon, she could feel the weight of stares from the gathering congregation. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps. "That's the one from the gallows, Carter's new wife. Just took her right off the hanging post, Rosie kept her eyes forward, clutching her hymnal like a shield. But as they found their seats in a back pew, she noticed Reverend Miller's wife catching her eye. The older woman's smile was warm and genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. It was like a shaft of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, the simple church filled with the sound of familiar hymns. Rosie's voice, unused to singing, started soft but grew stronger as she joined the congregation in amazing grace. The words about being lost and found touched something deep inside her. After the final prayer, while folks gathered on the church steps, Mrs. Carter, A plump woman who shared Eli's surname but no relation approached them with purpose in her step. "Miss Rosie," she said, her gray curls bobbing, "you must come for tea sometime, perhaps when you return from your journey." Her kind eyes crinkled at the corners. "I make a blackberry pie that'll put meat on those bones." "I'd like that," Rosie replied, surprised at how much she meant it. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." By midday, they were mounted and ready for the journey to Silver Bluff. Their saddlebags bulged with supplies: dried beef, beans, coffee, extra ammunition, and warm blankets. The letters from White Elk rode safely in Rosie's inside pocket, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. The winter sun tracked across the sky as they rode, their horses' hooves crunching through crusted snow. Ailey led them along old hunting trails, avoiding the deeper drifts. They spoke little, saving their breath in the thin air, but the silence between them was comfortable. As dusk approached, they made camp near a frozen stream. The water sang beneath its icy cover, a quiet melody in the gathering darkness. While Eli unsaddled the horses and set up a makeshift shelter using the canvas tarp, Rosie got a small fire going. Soon the smell of cooking beans mixed with wood smoke in the crisp air. "You've done this before," Eli observed, watching her tend the fire with sure movements. Rosie nodded, stirring the pot. "Papa used to take me camping when he'd go to sell furs, before the fever took him and Mama both." She stared into the flames. 3 years ago now." Ailey settled on a log across from her, accepting a tin plate of beans. "Lost my folks, too. Pa to a fall from horseback, Ma to grief not long after." He studied his plate. "Ranch gets mighty quiet sometimes." "How do you bear it?" Rosie asked softly. "The loneliness?" "Work helps. Animals need tending whether you're feeling sorry for yourself or not." He looked up at the stars appearing overhead. "And I reckon the good Lord knows what he's about, even when we don't understand his timing." They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low. The cold stars wheeled overhead, countless points of light in the velvet darkness. A coyote called in the distance, and their horses nickered softly in response. "Sometimes I wake up thinking I'll hear Mama singing in the kitchen," Rosie admitted, wrapping her blanket tighter, "or Papa's boots on the porch." She blinked back, tears that threatened to freeze on her cheeks. "The missing doesn't go away," Eli said gently, "but it changes. Gets softer around the edges, like an old quilt that's been washed many times." Rosie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment, she gathered their tin plates and scraped them clean with snow. The familiar task helped steady her emotions. "Best get some sleep," Eli said, banking the fire. "We've got hard riding tomorrow if we want to make Silver Bluff by nightfall." They settled into their separate bedrolls, the canvas tarp protecting them from the worst of the wind. The horses stood ground-tied nearby, their warm bodies offering some shelter. Despite the cold, Rosie felt strangely peaceful. The day's memories, Mrs. Carter's invitation, the hymn singing, this quiet talk with Eli, seemed to wrap around her like a warm shawl. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the vast spray of stars above, unchanged her parents had gazed upon them, constant as God's love. For the first time in years, she felt like she might be finding her way home. The second day of their journey dawned harsh and unforgiving. Ice had formed overnight, coating every branch and blade of grass in a crystal sheath. Rosie pulled her coat tighter as they broke camp, her fingers stiff with cold as she rolled her bedding. "Weather's turning," Eli observed, checking the horses' hooves for packed snow. "Need to watch our step on the trail ahead." They mounted up and started riding just as the sun cleared the eastern ridges. The horses moved carefully, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Wind whipped down from the mountains, finding every gap in their clothing. Rosie's cheeks burned from the cold, and she tucked her chin deeper into her wool scarf. The trail wound through stands of bare aspens, their white trunks stark against the steel-gray sky. Ice crackled beneath the horses' hooves, making both riders tense with each step. Ale led them along the safest paths, avoiding the worst patches where they could. "You holding up all right?" he called back during one of their brief stops to rest the horses. Rosie nodded, stamping her feet to keep the blood flowing. "I've had worse days," she managed a small smile. "At least nobody's trying to hang me today." Eli's expression softened at her attempt at humor. "Reckon you're right about that." By late afternoon, when the winter sun was already sliding toward the horizon, Silver Bluff's buildings appeared through the trees. The town sat nestled against the mountainside, its collection of wooden structures and stone buildings looking like a child's toy village from their elevation. "There it is," Eli said, pointing to the courthouse's distinctive cupola. "Records office should be right beside it." They guided their tired horses down the final stretch of trail into town. The livery stable stood at the edge of the settlement, its weathered sign creaking in the wind. The stableman, a grizzled old-timer with a pronounced limp, showed them to 2 clean stalls. "Feed and water's included," he said, accepting Eli's payment. "Extra charge for blankets, though. Gets mighty cold up here." "We'll take 2, Eli said, counting out additional coins. The general store rose 2 stories high on the town's main street, with rooms for rent above. A bell chimed as they entered, and the shopkeeper's wife looked up from her ledger. "Got 1 room left," she said, eyeing their wedding rings. "Small, but clean." Eli glanced at Rosie, who nodded slightly. They'd discussed this possibility during their planning. Sharing a room would raise fewer questions than requesting separate accommodations. The room was indeed small, with a narrow bed, a chair, and a washstand. A braided rug covered most of the plank floor, and thick curtains hung at the single window. "I'll take the floor," Eli said immediately, setting down their bags. "Thank you," Rosie replied softly, appreciating his continued thoughtfulness. The shopkeeper's wife invited them to share supper in the store's kitchen, a warm space that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. As they ate bowls of hearty stew, Eli outlined his plans for the morning. "Records office opens at 8 o'clock, he said, breaking off a piece of bread. "I'll start there, see what I can find about the treaty filing." Rosie set down her spoon. "I could help by talking to people in town. Sometimes folks will tell a woman things they won't tell a man." She smiled slightly. "Especially if they think she's just being friendly and curious." Eli considered this. Might work. The treaty would have been filed 20 years back. Could be some old-timers around who remember it. "I'll be careful," Rosie assured him. "Just casual conversations, nothing to raise suspicions." After supper, they returned to their room. The temperature had dropped further, and their breath misted in the air until Eli got a small fire going in the pot-bellied stove. Rosie sat on the edge of the bed, unwinding her hair from its travel-worn braid. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about the ranch." "Oh?" Eli paused in arranging his bedroll on the floor. "It's starting to feel like home," she admitted quietly. "The routine of it, the animals, even the sound of the creek under the ice. I never thought I'd find that feeling again after my parents... Eli was silent for a moment, but when he spoke, his voice was warm. "I'm glad you came, Rosie, even if the circumstances were... double quote." He trailed off, searching for words. "Unusual?" She supplied with a small laugh. "That's one way to put it." He smiled faintly in the lamplight. "But I'm glad all the same." They settled into their respective sleeping places. The lamp turned low. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting Silver Bluff's rooftops with fresh white. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had shelter, warmth, and a growing trust between them that neither had expected to find. Morning arrived with frost etching delicate patterns across the room's single window. Rosie woke to find Eli already dressed and warming his hands by the stove. They shared a quick breakfast of hard rolls and coffee before heading to the courthouse. The Records office occupied a cramped room smelling of dust and old paper. A thin clerk with wire-rimmed spectacles perched behind a high desk, surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. Treaty records from 20 years ago? The clerk adjusted his spectacles, frowning. Let me check the lending ledger. Eli and Rosie waited, exchanging hopeful glances as the clerk thumbed through a massive book. The only sound was the scratch of his pen and the tick of a wall clock. Ah, yes. The clerk's finger stopped on an entry. The document in question was loaned out to ... He squinted at the faded ink. A Mr. White Elk. Never returned, I'm afraid. Rosie's heart sank. When was this? 3 years ago. The clerk closed the ledger with a decisive thump. Most irregular. We don't usually loan original documents, but he had some sort of special dispensation. Eli leaned forward. Where might we find White Elk? The Ute winter camp is in the foothills, the clerk replied. 2 days' ride, assuming the weather holds. Before they could discuss their next move, hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. A boy from the telegraph office burst in, clutching a yellow paper. Message for Mr. Carter, he announced, breathing hard. Urgent. Eli took the telegram, his expression darkening as he read. Rosie moved closer, reading over his shoulder. The words hit her like a physical blow. Carter barn burned, stop letters gone, stop. Who'll have taken my offer, stop Clyde Pierre Essoen. Beneath the telegram was a note in Clyde's bold scrawl. Hope you weren't counting on those old papers. Eli's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. His hands crumpled the paper. We're going back, he said, voice hard with controlled anger. Now. They collected their belongings and horses in record time. The winter sun had barely reached its peak when they set out, pushing their mounts as fast as they dared on the icy trail. Eli's face remained set in grim lines, speaking only to warn of dangerous patches ahead. The temperature dropped as afternoon waned. Wind cut through their coats, carrying the scent of snow. When darkness threatened, they were forced to make camp in a grove of thick pines that offered some shelter from the biting wind. Eli winced as he dismounted, one hand going to his side. In the fading light, Rosie noticed dark stains on his coat. You're hurt, she said, stepping closer. What happened? Had a disagreement with some of Clyde's friends in town, he admitted reluctantly. Well, you were talking to the shopkeeper's wife yesterday. Let me see. Her tone brooked no argument. By the light of their small fire, Rosie examined the bruising along Eli's ribs. The skin was mottled purple and tender to the touch. She dug in their supplies for the tin of liniment she'd packed. Hold still, she instructed, applying the sharp-smelling remedy with gentle fingers. Eli sat quietly, his breath catching only slightly when she found particularly sore spots. Should have told me, she scolded softly. Didn't want to worry you. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. Rosie finished her ministrations and sat back, wiping her hands on her skirt. The familiar scent of pine needles and wood smoke filled the air, reminding her of evenings at the ranch. Looking at Eli's profile in the flickering light, something shifted in her heart. The thought of leaving his side, of returning to her solitary life, suddenly seemed impossible to bear. This quiet, honorable man had become more than just her rescuer. He was home. Thank you, Eli said, carefully pulling his shirt back on. For everything, Rosie nodded, not trusting her voice. They sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance while an owl called somewhere in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had this moment of peace beneath the wheeling stars. The fire burned low, and they prepared for sleep. Rosie arranged her blankets close to the dying embers, thinking of the burned barn and their lost evidence. But as she drifted off, her last thought wasn't of documents or legal battles. It was of Eli's gentle hands and steadfast heart, and the way he'd made room in his life for a stranger who was no longer strange at all. The winter sun hung low on the horizon as Eli and Rosie crested the final ridge, overlooking the Carter Ranch. The sight below made them both pull their horses to a halt. Where the barn had stood proud for 20 years, only a blackened skeleton remained, its charred beams reaching toward the darkening sky like accusing fingers. Eli's face went pale. He spurred his horse forward, Rosie following close behind. The acrid smell of burned wood and hay grew stronger as they approached, mixing with another scent that made Rosie's stomach clench. "No," Eli whispered, swinging down from his saddle. He stumbled toward the pen where they'd left the calf. The small body lay motionless under a scorched tarp, overcome by smoke before it could escape. Eli knelt beside it, shoulders rigid with grief and exhaustion. Rosie dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the long ride. The destruction was even worse up close. Clyde's men had been thorough, not just burning the barn, but destroying the stored hay and feed as well. Without shelter or provisions, surviving the rest of winter would be nearly impossible. "The letters," Eli said, his voice rough. He pushed himself to his feet and picked through the ruins, searching for any trace of the bundle they'd found in the loft. But there was nothing left except ash and twisted metal from the tools that had been stored there. The last light was fading when Eli finally gave up the search. He walked to the porch steps and sank down heavily, dropping his head into his hands. Rosie had never seen him look so defeated. She knelt beside him on the wooden steps, close enough to feel the tremors of exhaustion running through his body. "We can still fight this," she said firmly. "We'll find another way." Eli didn't respond. The wind whispered through the blackened timbers behind them, carrying the bitter scent of destruction. Rosie placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension there. "Let me fix us something to eat," she said gently. "You need rest." He nodded mutely, but didn't move. Rosie squeezed his shoulder once before rising, to take care of the horses and prepare a simple meal from their remaining supplies. Later, in her small bedroom, Rosie lay awake listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling. The moon cast silver light through her window, and her mind kept returning to something the clerk had said in Silver Bluff. White Elk had taken the treaty copy. The elder who had known Eli's father, who might still have proof of their water rights. Idea that had been forming since then crystallized into certainty. She couldn't let Eli lose everything he'd worked for, not after he'd risked so much to save her life. If White Elk had the document they needed, she would find him. Rosie waited until the house grew completely still. Then she slipped from beneath her quilt, already dressed in her warmest clothes. She moved silently through the darkened house, gathering supplies into a small pack: dried beef, hard bread, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and her mother's old compass. In the kitchen, she found paper and a stub of pencil. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "I'll bring help. R." She left the note where Eli would find it in the morning, weighted down with a cup. Then she eased the door open and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air bit at her face as she made her way to the stable. The one blessing of the barn fire was that the horses had been with them in Silver Bluff. She chose the steadier of the two, a sturdy bay mare, and saddled her by touch in the darkness. Asterisk as she led the horse away from the house. Rosie paused too. Look back. Eli's bedroom window remained dark. Part of her ached to wake him, to not leave him alone with his grief. But she knew he would never let her make this journey by herself, and she couldn't bear to watch him push himself any further. In his exhausted state. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as Rosie mounted up and pointed the mare's head toward the distant foothills. She had heard enough stories in town to have a general idea where the Ute winter camp lay. Whether she could find it, whether White Elk would help her, whether she could make it there and back before the next storm. These were questions she pushed aside. She had to try. The mare's hooves made soft sounds in the crusty snow as they picked their way across the valley floor. Rosie kept the reins loose, trusting the horse's sure-footedness in the dim light. As the sun finally crept above the horizon, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, she thought of Eli waking to find her gone. "I'll make this right," she whispered, as much a prayer as a promise. Then she touched her heels to the mares' sides, urging her into a faster pace. The foothills loomed ahead, their shadows stretching long across the winter-white plain, and somewhere in those hills waited their last hope for justice. That the wind howled across the snow-covered slopes, whipping Rosie's cloak against her legs as she guided her mare along the treacherous mountain path. Heavy clouds churned overhead, dropping curtains of snow that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The bay mare picked her way carefully, steam rising from her flanks despite the bitter cold. By mid-afternoon, Rosie's fingers had gone numb inside her worn gloves. The temperature kept dropping as another squall swept in, forcing her to seek shelter. Through the swirling white, she spotted a rocky outcropping with a deep alcove carved into its face. She urged her tired horse toward it, relief flooding through her. As they ducked under the natural shelter, the alcove was just deep enough to protect them from the driving snow. Rosie dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling from hours in the saddle. She untied her bedroll with clumsy fingers and spread it in the driest spot she could find. The mare crowded close, sharing what warmth she could. "Good girl," Rosie murmured, patting the horse's neck. She gathered what little dry kindling she could find and used precious matches to start a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rock walls as she melted snow in her tin cup, adding the last of her coffee grounds. The hot liquid helped chase away some of the bone-deep chill. That night, Rosie huddled against her horse's warm bulk, listening to the storm rage outside their shelter. She thought of Eli, hoping he would understand why she had to do this alone. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the howling wind and the crack of frozen branches. Dawn brought clearer skies, but deeper snow. Rosie shared the last of her hard bread with the mare before mounting up. They pushed on through drifts that sometimes reached the horse's belly, following what she hoped was the trail to the Ute winter camps. Near midday, movement caught her. A flash of color against the white. A boy, perhaps 12 years old, stood watching her from behind a snow-laden pine. He wore buckskins and carried a rabbit stick, his dark eyes wary but curious. Rosie reined her horse to a stop, remembering how White Elk's letters had been written in both Ute and English. She raised her empty hand in greeting. "Hello," she called. Softly, "I seek White Elk's camp." The boy emerged fully from behind the tree, but kept his distance. He studied her for a long moment before responding in careful English. "Why you look for Elder's camp?" "I come from Eli Carter's ranch," Rosie explained. "We need White Elk's help. There is a man trying to steal Carter Creek, the water that White Elk's father and Eli's father agreed to share." The boy's expression shifted at the mention of the treaty. He took a few steps closer, looking at her more carefully. "You are Carter's woman?" "His wife," Rosie nodded. "We were married 2 weeks ago." She didn't elaborate on the circumstances, but something in her voice must have conveyed her sincerity. The boy glanced at the darkening sky, then back at her. After a moment's consideration, he gestured for her to follow. "Camp is half days. Ride, I show you way." Relief washed through Rosie. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "I'm much obliged." They traveled in silence, the boy leading her along hidden paths that wound through the trees. As the sun began to set, smoke appeared in the distance, thin gray columns rising from a sheltered valley. Rosie's guide pointed toward the smoke. "White Elk's camp." They descended into the valley where a cluster of hide tents stood in a rough circle. Children stopped their play to stare as Rosie rode past. Women paused in their work, and several men moved to intercept them. The boy spoke quickly in Ute, gesturing toward Rosie. An older man emerged from one of the larger tents. His face was deeply lined, his long gray hair bound with a beaded leather strip. He carried himself with quiet dignity that reminded Rosie of Eli's father in the daguerreotype that hung in the ranch house. "White Elk," the boy said to Rosie, then spoke again in Ute to the elder. White Elk studied Rosie for a long moment. "You are far from Carterland," he said finally, his English clear despite its careful cadence. "Why do you seek me?" Rosie slid down from her horse, her legs shaky from cold and exhaustion. She bowed her head respectfully before meeting his eyes. "I am Ely Carter's wife," she began. "A man named Clyde Parson is trying to steal Carter Creek. He burned our barn and destroyed the letters your father wrote about the water treaty." White Elk's expression remained grave as she continued, explaining how Clyde had filed false claims and how they had searched the territorial offices without success. "The clerk said you might still have a copy of the original treaty," she finished. "Without proof, we'll lose everything. The water, the ranch, the agreement your father and Eli's father made to share the land in peace." The elder was silent for several heartbeats. Then he nodded slowly. "I remember young Carter, a good man like his father." He gestured for Rosie to follow him into his tent. "Wait here." Inside, White Elk moved to a painted wooden chest. He opened it carefully and withdrew a leather bundle tied with sinew. Unwrapping it revealed yellowed papers covered in precise handwriting. English on one side, Ute symbols on the other. "My father kept this copy," White Elk said, "to remember the day two men chose peace over conflict." He held the papers out to Rosie. "Now it will serve justice again." Rosie's hands trembled as she accepted the precious document. "Thank you," she whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "We'll honor the treaty always, just as Eli's father did." White Elk's family welcomed Rosie to their evening meal, the tent, warm and fragrant with cooking meat. His wife, Gray Dove, ladled rich venison stew into a wooden bowl and passed it to Rosie with a gentle smile. The savory broth and tender meat warmed her thoroughly after the long, cold ride. Children peeked at her from behind their mothers' skirts while the adults spoke quietly in Ute. White Elk translated occasionally, sharing stories of when Eli's father first came to these lands. "He was a man who kept his word," the elder said, stirring the fire. "His son is the same." Rosie nodded, thinking of Eli's quiet strength. "That's why I had to come," she said softly. "He gave me a chance when no one else would. I couldn't let him lose everything." Gray Dove spread thick furs near the fire for Rosie to sleep on. Despite her exhaustion, she lay awake for a while, watching the shadows dance on the tent walls and listening to the wind in the pines. The treaty papers rested safely beside her, wrapped carefully in oilcloth White Elk had provided. Dawn broke clear and cold. After a breakfast of dried berries and corn cakes, Rosie prepared to leave. White Elk's grandson had already saddled her horse, checking the cinch carefully. Gray Dove pressed a small packet of dried meat into Rosie's hands, patting her arm with motherly concern. "Travel safely," White Elk said as Rosie mounted up. "The spirits of honest men go with you." Rosie bowed her head in thanks, then turned her mare toward home. The morning sun sparkled on the fresh snow, making the world seem clean and new. She kept a steady pace, mindful of both her horse's strength and the precious cargo she carried. By midday, the trail descended from the foothills into more familiar territory. Rosie relaxed slightly, thinking she might make it home before dark. Then she heard horses approaching. She reined in sharply as three riders appeared around a bend ahead. Her heart sank as she recognized Clyde Parsons' sneering face. His two companions were rough-looking men she had seen hanging around the saloon in Trinity Forks. Well, Clyde drawled, blocking the narrow trail. "If it ain't Carter's charity case, out for a ride." His eyes narrowed. "Long way from home, ain't you?" "Let me pass," Rosie said firmly, though her hands trembled on the reins. Clyde nudged his horse forward. "Reckon you've been visiting our Indian friends. Might be carrying something interesting." He nodded to his companions. "Search your saddlebags." saddlebags. Before they could move, Rosie yanked her reins hard to the right and kicked her mare's flanks. The horse lunged off the trail into the trees, snow flying from her hooves. Shouts erupted behind her as Clyde and his men gave chase. Branches whipped past as Rosie crouched low over her horse's neck. She guided the mare between tree trunks and over fallen logs, trusting the animal's sure-footedness. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Then a sharp crack split the air. A bullet splintered bark near her head. "They're shooting!" she gasped. Her mare needed no encouragement to run faster. Rosie's world narrowed to the space between the trees. The thunder of hooves and the precious weight of the treaty against her chest. She cut sharply left down a steep slope, then splashed through an icy stream. The cold water drenched her boots, but she pressed on. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded. Rosie slowed her exhausted horse to a walk, listening intently. Only the whisper of wind through bare branches reached her ears. She had lost them, but the delay meant she wouldn't reach home until after nightfall. The sun was setting when she finally spotted the familiar shape of the Carter ranch house. A lamp burned in the window, and she could make out Eli's figure by the corral, working on the broken gate in the failing light. He straightened at the sound of hooves, then rushed forward as he recognized her. "Rosie," the relief in his voice made her throat tight. "I've been half out of my mind with worry." She slid from the saddle into his waiting arms, her legs wobbly from the long ride in the chase. "I found him," she said, fumbling with her coat to pull out the oilcloth package. White Elk had the treaty copy, just like they said. Eli took the bundle with trembling hands, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he pulled Rosie into a fierce embrace, one hand cradling the back of her head. She felt him shaking slightly, and realized how afraid he must have been. "When I found your note, Will quotes," he murmured against her hair. "Anything could have happened to you out there alone." "I had to try," Rosie whispered back. "I couldn't let Clyde take your land, not after everything you've done for me." Eli drew back just enough to look at her face, his eyes bright with emotion in the gathering dusk. Relief and something deeper shone in his expression as he held her close, the precious treaty papers pressed between them like a promise kept. The morning sun streamed through Trinity Forks courthouse windows as Eli and Rosie took their seats in the crowded room. The territorial judge, a silver-haired man with keen eyes, sat behind the weathered oak bench. Townspeople filled the wooden pews, their whispers echoing off the high ceiling. White Elk stood before the court, his dignity commanding silence. In measured words, he explained how his father had made the original treaty with Eli's father, and how he had preserved this copy as sacred trust. The judge examined the yellowed pages carefully, noting the matching signatures and territorial seal. "This document appears authentic," the judge declared. "Mr. Parson, step forward." Clyde swaggered to the front, but his usual smirk faltered under the judge's stern gaze. Evidence of the barn fire mounted as witnesses described seeing Clyde and his men riding away that night. The preacher rose to speak of Rosie's character, describing her faithful attendance at services and her gentle way with the sick calf before it died. "Furthermore," the minister added, "I've witnessed the legitimate marriage and growing bond between Mrs. Carter and her husband. They faced these trials with grace and truth." The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "I find in favor of the Carters. The water rights to Carter Creek are hereby confirmed." He turned his steely gaze to Sheriff Parson. "Given the evidence of corruption and conspiracy, you will surrender your badge immediately." To Clyde, he added, "You will pay full restitution for the burned barn and livestock." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Rosie gripped Eli's hand tight, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks. Justice had prevailed. They stood together, no longer the desperate strangers who had met at the gallows, but partners who had fought for truth and won. The spring thaw brought new life to Carter Creek. its waters running clear and strong between the banks. Eli worked steadily, digging holes for young cottonwood saplings, while Rosie carried bucket after bucket of water to nourish each tender tree. Their quiet work was often interrupted now by friendly visits, Mrs. Peterson bringing fresh-baked bread, the Cooper boys offering spare tools, and even the miller stopping by with seed for planting. At Sunday service, the church pews no longer held judgment. Instead, warm smiles and welcoming nods greeted them, acceptance replacing the old whispers of scandal. As evening painted the sky in golds and purples, Eli and Rosie sat together on their porch. The creek's gentle song filled the cooling air. "I married you to save your life," Eli said softly, his voice full of wonder. "Turns out you saved mine." Rosie leaned against his shoulder, feeling the rightness of belonging here. Peace settled over them both as the creek murmured its endless song in the distance. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around, subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.